Hi there, it's Riikka Kovasin here with another video for embossing powders. This time I'm doing a really basic technique called resist. I'm using the resist effect with 3 different mediums. These are inks, watercolors and acrylic paints. First I make kind of a master sheet which I then cut to the individual cards. To pattern my sheet I use a stamp by Rebel Studio and embossing ink. I stamp the pattern repeatedly to a white cardstock and then emboss it using bright white embossing powder. The cardstock I'm using is 160 grams, so it's sturdy enough to hold the mediums. After coating the cardstock with the powder, I heat the powder to create the resist effect. The resist means that the pattern I just created resists the color that I'm then adding on top. Here's the cardstock with the embossing powder melted. As it's white on white, you can't really see much, but after I apply the color, you can see the pattern appearing. I wanted to use the same cardstock for each technique so you can see how the medium affects to the resist effect rather than the paper or the color of the embossing powder. So that's why I cut the A4 sized piece of cardstock to smaller pieces and then start applying the different mediums. First medium I'm adding is inks, and these are probably maybe the most used for resist. You can use any style of ink or any brand as long as for absorbing surfaces. So steer away from any kind of solvent-based inks because they don't work on top of paper for one, but also they will tint the embossing powder also. I'm using distress inks and distress oxides. As you can see, I'm just using a blending tool and applying the inks on top, and then the pattern appears. Applying ink on top of the resist pattern is actually easy because the blending tool kind of erases any ink residue that might be on top of the powder, so you don't have to do anything extra. As these inks are water reactive, so I'm using just a cloth to prevent my fingerprints coming to the ink. Here's the second coat. Again, it's the same cardstock that I just cut in pieces, but this time I'm applying watercolors on top. As you can see, the pattern doesn't appear in the same way as with ink, because then you're kind of rubbing the ink to the paper and the pattern reveals itself immediately. With watercolor, you might need to actually use a damp cloth to erase some of the paint afterwards. And also, the higher the contrast, the better. If you use white powder with slightly pink paint, that might not even show up, but with dark red or darker tones, the image will be clearer. Then the third medium, acrylic paints. As you probably know, acrylic paints will stick on top of plastic, which is embossing powder. So if you leave this too long, it will cover the whole pattern. But as acrylic paints don't handle wear and tear that well, you might get some of the paint off even when it's dry. But it's easier to do when it's still a little bit wet. It takes longer for the paint to dry on top of non-absorbing surface than on top of absorbing surface. So I applied the paint, as you could see, with a sponge, and then I take a cloth and rub it off from the raised pattern, the resist pattern. Then onwards with the actual cards. I trimmed the pieces a little bit and then mounted them on top of craft cardstock and added a little detail to the edge by sewing it to the base. Next I make some background pieces for my dolls, which are going to be the focal point. These are die cut from a coaster using a Sistex die, and I applied the WoW embossing ink on top. Then I sprinkled some ultra high silver there, just a few grains, and then coated the whole thing using etched platinum embossing powder from the metals trio. The ultra high grains create extra texture to the surface. Then I heat the powders and apply some ink on top. This is kind of another kind of ink resist. I'm only able to get the ink to the white coaster, so it kind of goes into the grooves and creates even more texture or appearance of texture that way. I treat all the 3 die cuts the same way and then adhere a piece of old book page in the back of each one. After getting the rings done, I then die cut another piece, this time a thin frame, which I cut in half because the frame itself was too short to fill the space I wanted, so I can hide that cut edge underneath the ring. I just adhere the frame in place, then the ring, and put the paper doll on top. For the frame and the ring I used just regular craft glue, but for the paper doll, as it's coming on top of a raised surface or dimensional piece, I'm using foam tape, partly and partly craft glue. As a finishing touch to these cards, I first added some seam binding using a stapler, and then I took some letter or sentiment stamps from Lawn Fawn and stamped them on top of craft cardstock. I used apple red embossing powder for the red one and bright white for the white ones. I trim each piece a little bit smaller and then adhere it to the card. And here's the finished trio, all of them with similar but a little bit different resist background. I hope you liked the video. Thank you for watching. Bye bye!